So, to kick off today's first session, I'd like to introduce Matthias Mattisson from IAB Europe and Will Chabert from MediaMath.
Good morning. Roughly 1.5 years ago, we embarked on a process to better understand the GDPR. And as part of that, we looked at how to deal with consent. And we realized we needed technical answers to some of these legal challenges. And we brought in engineers and product people, and we threw the GDPR at them. We said, we need to do this. They said, do we really have to deal with it? We said, yes, and so we did. And the result is what we now call the Transparency and Consent Framework, which we are very pleased to present to you today. To start off, we are going to talk a little bit about the legal context. Then we'll talk about sort of what the Transparency and Consent Framework addresses at a high level, and then Will is going to talk you through the technical concepts which your engineering teams would actually need to implement in order to become interoperable and compliant with this framework, and hopefully, thanks to it, also with the law. So, starting out with the legal context, some of the things which are stemming from the GDPR, which we can address with the Transparency and Consent Framework, are the accountability principle. So this idea that you need evidence of your compliance in pretty much all things, but particularly around consent, you need to be able to demonstrate that the data subject had consented to whatever you asked them to consent to. That's an important novelty of the GDPR that hasn't existed in the Data Protection Directive. The second thing that we need to really bear in mind with respect to consent, but also really beyond it, is transparency. And although that was a requirement in the past too, the fact that now there is a much broader spectrum of personal data which will be subject to these transparency rules, and also that these transparency rules are a little bit more robust, means that we need to deal with things a little bit differently. So transparency really means who's processing data, what data are they processing, why, when, for how long, how can we exercise control. And in the past, it was enough to say that unidentified third parties would be processing somebody's data and the user could consent to that. Today, you will have to say who specifically. By name, it's not going to be enough to describe a type of category of data controller that will be processing data on the basis of consent, and that creates some challenges. Lastly, we need to think about lawful processing. In order for processing of data to be lawful, you need a legal ground, which can be one of 6, and consent is not always needed, but it is an important one in our industry because of the e-privacy directive, the cookie law, and the future e-privacy regulation. And consent, of course, has pretty meaningfully changed itself. You need an affirmative act. It's no longer good enough to say, I assume you are okay with me processing this data because you haven't done anything. You need to be disclosed by name, which stems from these transparency rules, which I mentioned before. You need to disclose the exact purposes of the data processing. And again, this stems from the accountability principle, which we started out with. You need to be able to demonstrate valid consent. When do you need consent? When you want to, when you process personal data, or you have to if you are in scope of this law, the e-privacy directive, which applies to the storing of information or accessing of information on a device. So it applies to cookies, device identifiers, images on a device, or anything else that is sort of physically located on a user's device will require consent to access it unless it is strictly technically necessary. And spoiler alert, advertising and certainly data processing for advertising is not strictly technically necessary for a service to function because you can read the news without the ads. Today, the situation looks like this. The e-privacy directive establishes a requirement for member states to create laws which say you need consent. And get consent as defined by the Data Protection Act, the Wet bescherming persoonsgegevens, or the Codice in materia di protezione dei dati personali. And the definition of consent is very different for all of these. Some are closer to what the GDPR already or will require than others, and others are pretty far removed. As of tomorrow, all of these laws are gone. They are scrapped and replaced by the GDPR, including its definition of consent. So some of the old guidance on how to comply with the e-privacy directive will no longer be accurate because you will now need to meet the requirements that stem from the GDPR. So the GDPR and the e-privacy directive and future e-privacy regulation, they sort of coexist and have some degree of overlap. When you start your processing activities, usually I would expect that it starts with collecting the data you will be processing in the first place, and that collection over the internet requires accessing the user's device because that is where the data originates from. That is in scope of the e-privacy directive and requires consent. Once you have data that you have collected with the appropriate consent, you may process it towards certain purposes on the basis of a legal basis you find in the GDPR that doesn't have to be consent. It could be a legitimate interest, contract, legal obligation, you name it. However, where you are accessing and storing personal data on a device, that is the overlap in the middle. And you would wonder, well, now there's two laws that apply at the same time. One says I need consent, the other says I have 6 legal grounds for processing. Which one do I go for? In law, always the more specific rule, which is in this case the e-privacy directive, meaning where they overlap, you also need consent, just like on the left-hand side here. Which is to say, you will often need consent for at least parts of your processing activities, but then later may switch legal bases to something else. Which does then bring us to the issue of having to comply with all of these new requirements, which we as an industry traditionally haven't been able to do because we didn't have the infrastructure. We didn't have the standards to do so, and that's where the transparency and consent framework comes in, because it will help you meet these requirements by working together as brands, advertisers, publishers, and technology companies. Specifically, this framework will facilitate first parties making dynamic disclosures about who they're working with. So by that we mean first parties being able to pick vendors, technology providers with whom they work, and pull information about them and disclose that to the user. And when there is a change about that third-party technology provider's data processing activities, rather than that third party having to send an email to all of its publishing or brand partners saying, could you please manually go and update your privacy notice with my latest information? They can just do it in a central place, and the notice will be updated automatically. So we can make sure that transparency is afforded at all times in an accurate manner. And then secondly, the transparency and consent framework facilitates transmission of signals through the supply chain about what a user's choices have been, so that every participant in the chain will be able to independently demonstrate that they had consent. The Article 29 Working Party said that we don't want too much new data processing to have to happen in order to comply with this accountability principle, but we want you to have some sort of link, some sort of connection. That connection for the ad tech or the advertising industry will be that signal. And that signal follows a common data format that everybody will be able to understand, and as a result, we will move from assuming that the user had consented to whatever you're doing to knowing who the user has consented to and to which data processing activities. So if we do this right, we can provide much greater transparency to consumers, but also to publishers who not always have a great understanding about who their supply chain is. And with transparency comes the opportunity for exercising control. And in the first instance, that control will accrue to publishers who, using this framework, can curate essentially a whitelist of those vendors who they want to enable to process data on the basis of the disclosures they provide and the consents they obtain. And because now they have that control, they can, if they so choose, pass that control on to their users, which is sort of the goal of the GDPR, although it says where appropriate, there's different degrees of that control, right? But that will be up to the publisher to decide to pass on to their users. And in order to everybody to follow a standard or be able to do this, we need a standard, because it is completely unthinkable that thousands of technology vendors and millions of different websites and apps each have their own way of doing things. We are an interconnected industry that works very closely together, and we need an efficient way of doing so. At the same time, although we have a standard, we don't want to impose on any one company a relatively rigid interpretation of the law, a rigid requirement on what the user experience ought to be. So it was important for us, and we're pleased that we were able to achieve this, that there still is a great degree of flexibility to implement these standards in a manner that fits the user experience that the publisher wants, that enables them to provide the type of experience they think works best for their service, is most appreciated by their users, and doesn't impose interpretations of the law on either publishers or technology providers, but provides transparency into what those interpretations are, which then will facilitate making decisions about working together or not. And if we do it right, hopefully, this will mean there will be a minimization of disruption of the GDPR of our business model. I think it's safe to say that without it, and assuming that there will be some degree of enforcement, we don't do anything, we will be in trouble. We do this, we have a chance of continuing to do business, not continuing with the status quo, but to continue to be relying on technology to help monetize services and content that publishers produce, and to keep facilitating advertisers reaching their audiences in an effective manner. And with that, on to the technology.
Hello, I'm Will Chabert. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at MediaMath. I just want to start off by saying I'm very impressed that you all are here at 9 in the morning. I know some of us had somewhat of a late night last night. I think it's, what is it, GDPR therapy at the bar? I don't know, maybe it's just me. Okay, so as Matthias mentioned, there are a number of parts to the framework. And there are, from the way that I think about it, really 4 main parts, and we'll talk about like a 5th new part a little bit to the end. But the first one is the disclosure UI and that set of JavaScript APIs around that user interface, which is a decentralized concern. The second one is a global vendor list, right? We'll talk about the importance of that. That's managed by the IAB EU. The third one is the set of technical standards and framework standards, which are managed by IAB Tech Lab, in conjunction with the IAB EU working group, policy group. And finally, the framework policies themselves, which are owned and kind of overseen by IAB EU. And so I believe the IAB EU actually kind of started this effort, again, roughly a year and a half, 2 years ago, but we've been working kind of closely with the tech group, the tech lab to co-own these standards, as the tech lab does have substantial experience kind of managing ad tech standards. To start off, in order to be able to demonstrate to the user and disclose to the user who's actually participating in a transaction, we need to define who all the players in the transaction are, right? And so this starts with a global vendor list, right? And so the idea here is to have a centralized dynamic list of vendors, each of their purposes, which we'll get into in a bit, the legal bases behind those purposes, and things like the privacy policy URL and so forth. This vendor list is dynamic. It's versioned to allow for an audit trail. And publishers will use this list as a basis for their disclosure and consent requests. Now, that's not to say that they have to request on behalf of all of those, the vendors on the list, but they will use this list as kind of the master for which vendors to pick from. In order to be part of this list, both vendors and publishers will need to adhere to a set of like baseline principles and minimum standards. So pretty important, I think, to for the downstream considerations. The second part of it, as I mentioned, is the actual act of disclosing vendors and consent requests, right? And so what we've done here is we've standardized the mechanism by which publishers can receive that list of vendors from the GVL, the way that they would expose that to clients, and the way that they would actually maintain that that vendor list is up to date and effectively is the concern of actually keeping that data up to date, storing it, figuring out how to actually handle it. That is all technical complexity that's effectively abstracted away, right? And so that work is implemented in a JavaScript library and API, which a lot of the CMPs in this space will be implementing. Now, the great thing there, because we have actually focus this thing into a JavaScript API, is that we're giving publishers full control over the user experience by which they expose these requests, whether they're disclosure requests or consent requests in the UI. So just a note for everyone taking pictures, these next 3 slides are for the, only for the purposes of illustration. They're not to be looked at as like a canonical reference for how to do this, but we've got, I think, 3 different mechanisms here, 3 different sample user interfaces for how this thing might look. Very simple consent collection for all vendors and purposes. This is something that if your legal department is comfortable with, you can go ahead and pop up. Second one is, I think, a little bit more custom. Perhaps you want to dive in and actually see each of the different vendors that are associated with a particular purpose. That's great. Again, yet another possible illustration behind how this might look. And then, a third one with even more granular level sort of control, right? Giving the user the access to manipulate the individual vendors that they might consent to. So again, the purpose behind this level of customization is to say that publishers have full control over the way that they want to expose this sort of disclosure and this sort of consent request. Okay. Great, so at this point, we have disclosed the vendors, and we've asked where appropriate for consent. Now we need to store it, right? And so signal storage typically requires 2 different things. It requires a user identification method and a persistence method. We talk about those things kind of as separate concerns because identification is typically something in a global construct requires things like ID syncing. And there are a bunch of different ways that that could be done in a global scope. And that's something that can be determined by the publisher and the vendor, right? We anticipate that some CMPs will effectively be trying to pool consent amongst a number of different publishers, and if they want to implement kind of like a third-party sync solution to enable it, that's great. We also anticipate that a lot of publishers will not want to participate in any sort of like login collective, login alliance, that sort of thing, and so that's gives them the opportunity to store all of that consent data in the first party. The second thing is the persistence method, right? And so the most basic and most obvious sort of implementation of a persistence mechanism for this consent information is in a cookie, right? But obviously cookies are lossy, and so this is, again, we have focused on the format of the data itself rather than the way that it is stored, so that the vendors who are implementing this sort of functionality have full control over how they would like to store the data, so that if they want to do a server-side lookup, they can. And the flexibility is just kind of inherently baked into the JavaScript, right? So you can implement the identification or the storage mechanism however you see fit. Okay, the next aspect of this entire thing is the transition of the vendor permissions and of the consent state, right? So this is where a lot of the complexity comes into play, and this is why this standard is so important. I'm going to kind of page forward to an example. This is a example of an RTB flow, right? In a number of programmatic auction-based buying mechanisms, data does transmit between a lot of different players, right? You have a publisher-side ad server, you have some SSPs or exchanges, you have some DSPs, and then maybe you have a dynamic creative optimization vendor hanging off of the of one of that DSPs, and perhaps you have a viewability vendor, perhaps you have a multi-touch attribution vendor. Every single one of those connections represents an opportunity to transmit that consent and that disclosure state, right? And so because of that, we've had to determine and develop a mechanism by which we can actually transmit that state from every single member in the transaction so that we can all decide whether or not it's appropriate for us to process that data in real time. Now, it's really important for us in this process to actually figure out a way to compress this data, since we're talking about order of magnitude of, 5-ish purposes and order of magnitude of, I imagine in the future, once the vendor list is fully populated, 1,000 or 2,000 vendors. And so it's really important for us to compress this payload into as small of a piece of data as possible, because if you append, I think the back of the napkin math was if you append roughly 2 kilobytes of data to every single one of these requests, then for every scaled ad tech vendor, we would immediately need to start processing an incremental 80 gigabits per second, which is very expensive and an unnecessary tax on all of our companies, but even more importantly, the user experience, right? So we want to make sure that we don't do that because especially in parts of the developing world, not everyone has unlimited bandwidth caps, for example, on their mobile devices, right? So what we've done is we've effectively developed a bitmap-like structure, which enables us to compress all of this data into as small of a data structure possible. And this is something that, there's been ongoing iteration between the policy and technical teams to figure out how to do that. And then we will effectively pass that data via daisy chain. And so upstream parties in a transaction will pass that through the chain to the downstream members. And so as of, I believe, February 9 of this year, the OpenRTB commit group did approve a specification for consent transmission via the regs extension GDPR and user extension consent objects. So really exciting stuff. To give you, I think, an illustrative example of what this thing actually looks like when I talk about bitmap, it's literally just a list of ones and zeros. So does someone have it or does someone not have it? It's pretty easy. It's like a binary toggle. And so here you have representation of these 5 different purposes and these 41 or so different vendors. Some of them have the choice turned on. Some of them do not. And the way that that would represent itself here, and this is the part that I always struggle with being colorblind, some of these do have the ability to process and some of them don't, and I think it's pink. Yeah? Pink? All right, cool. So in these examples, you can imagine if you are in the pink boxes, you will effectively receive the consent state. You will see that you do not have, that the user has not chosen to allow you to process this data, and therefore at that point, if you have received the data, you must kind of drop it on the floor and not process it and respect the user's choice. So combined, these things enable control over the vendors enabled by publishers, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. It provides transparency into the supply chain for both consumers and publishers, right, made possible through the UI. It enables an audit trail that gives all of the supply chain members confidence that they are able to process this data by providing a more efficient disclosure mechanism so that we know that we're allowed as opposed to we assume that we're allowed. And then finally, a better user experience and more efficiency in working together than if all of us were to try to solve this thing on our own. As I mentioned, thousands of vendors in the ad tech space, it becomes very complex when we try to solve this by ourselves. Okay, so I mentioned that this is a sort of an iterative process. And I believe in the course of, I want to say November, December, and then really kind of leading into February, there were a lot of conversations with the publisher community about what it would take for them to become comfortable with the framework, right? And I think a lot of us kind of looking back on the process said, okay, that is probably something that we could have started a little bit sooner, but we really did engage in very heavy conversations with the publisher community, and they approached the working group for a solution that would actually allow them to have more control over the vendors on the page, right? And so a lot of this process kind of brought to light a number of the transaction modalities that publishers maybe didn't have as much awareness or control over, right? And so what they effectively asked for was a way to configure the purposes per vendors and to have control over which vendors were listed in the UI. So, said very simply, allow themselves to protect themselves from vendors that they don't necessarily have a direct relationship with. Now, this is a problem because of the way the internet works, right? HTML and JavaScript, it's really easy for someone to call a piece of JavaScript that then embeds someone else's JavaScript, right? You can't really control that. That's just the way that JavaScript happens to work. And so that means that any publisher, any site owner has to be comfortable with the idea that someone else might just show up on their page that they may not have the ability to stop. And so this protocol effectively defines specific restrictions which members of the, this framework need to adhere to. And so our goal here was to, in this extension, is to provide a standard for publishers to publicly declare the vendors that they're working with and their permissions and configurations, allow the vendors to verify publishers' GDPR settings and verify and audit the CMP consent string. It enables publishers to limit purposes on a per vendor basis and features on a per vendor basis. This is currently conceived of as an optional feature to the transparency and consent framework, but it's one that I personally find very exciting because it's yet another level of control and yet another, I think, restriction that makes the user experience of these disclosures and consents more palatable. And so what is our solution here? It's this thing called pubvendors.json, short for publishervendors.json. This thing is very similar to ads.txt, right? If everyone here is familiar with ads.txt, it's the ability for publishers to disclose which suppliers that their inventory can be bought from. And very similarly here, the idea is publishers to declare which vendors they would like to allow on a page, right? So enabling them to limit which vendors show up on the page and to be clear about those disclosures. And so the integration here is actually relatively straightforward. There's a specification that we've developed, which you'll see an example of in a second. The publisher effectively places the pubvendors.json file at a well-known path within the domain, and the consent management platform checks for that the existence of that file in that path and uses that to filter the list of vendors which are presented to the user. Finally, SSPs and DSPs will use that file as an out-of-band solution to augment the consent string by crawling the publisher's sites. Again, this is for those vendors in the space, largely a understood problem due to ads.txt, so hopefully not an undue burden from an infrastructure perspective. Okay, you're probably wondering what this thing actually looks like. So this is the V1 of the specification, which is available today. Publishers can implement this today, and it effectively enables vendors to rely on legitimate interest, right? And so this is kind of where the trickiness in the complexity in the standard comes in, is publishers will still need to disclose vendors who are relying on legitimate interest, and which is why in a scenario where they aren't doing that, the vendors need to know that they aren't actually allowed to be on the page, right? That disclosure is very important, as Matthias mentioned. Looking kind of forward a little bit, the 1.1 proposal, which is currently under review and open for public comment, which I believe that period closes at June 1, is it actually enables publishers to further restrict purposes by vendor. So saying that we're okay with specific vendors doing some things, but not other things. And paired with that, there is a relatively minor update to the global vendor list, which expands like the purpose level of control, effectively asking them to declare the specific legal basis for individual purposes, and also to declare which of those purposes are absolutely required for their services to operate, right? So maybe you haven't received that choice or haven't received clearance from the publisher to actually do something. If it's a particular purpose that is required, then and you don't have that purpose enabled, maybe you don't want to partake in the transaction. And then finally, the last thing with the 1.1 proposal that's coming down the pipe is a very minor change to the daisy bit, right? That consent string that was discussed yesterday, where it will be effectively modified to pass the version of the pub vendors JSON. So just think of this as like a version flag, where if it's 0, the file doesn't exist. And that file version can be used by those downstream parties who are crawling for the file on a regular basis to decide that they need to now go get a new version of it. Timeline on pub vendors 1.0 and 1.1. 1.0 is available for immediate use by publishers and CMPs, and the 1.1 specification is currently under review and open for public comments. So that review cycle ends on June 1st, and you can go to, if you're interested in taking a look at this, go to the GitHub, the IAB's GitHub page for GDPR transparency and consent. And if you happen to be looking at this deck later, you could click that hideous looking link and it would take you to the specific page. Thank you.